Jigsaw 들어갔고.
Jo, da hau drapeau.
Yes, sir.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me this afternoon. Today I want to talk to you about COVID, about vaccinations, and about mandates. But first I want to address the elephant in the room, our increasingly divided society. I entered politics because I wanted to help create a society where Kiwis can get ahead, where if you're willing to put in an honest Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me this afternoon. Today I want to talk to you about COVID, about vaccinations, and about mandates. But first I want to address the elephant in the room, our increasingly divided society. I entered politics because I wanted to help create a society where Kiwis can get ahead, where if you're willing to put in an honest day's work, there's no limit to what you can achieve. That's my vision for New Zealand, a society of opportunity. But what we're experiencing under Labour is a society divided. The Prime Minister talks about the team of 5 million, but actually she leads the most divisive government in recent memory. Renters versus landlords, business owners versus workers, farmers versus cities, Kiwis at home versus those stuck abroad, the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. What we're seeing outside Parliament and the reaction to it is the culmination of underlying issues that have been rumbling along in our communities for some time. It's driven by COVID and vaccine mandates, yes, but the frustrations shared by many Kiwis are also driven by a government that seems to be stalling. The cost of living is through the roof, the dream of home ownership is turning into a nightmare, long-term dependency is skyrocketing, and then add to the mix Labour's approach to COVID, which relies too heavily on controlling all aspects of everyday life, rather than using tools like rapid antigen tests to manage the risk and to give Kiwis more personal responsibility. No wonder Kiwis are frustrated. 2 years ago, when the Prime Minister made the wise decision to put New Zealand into a strict lockdown, we were united in our resolve. We came together to combat COVID-19 and we felt good about it. What was simple then is messy and complicated 2 years on. Many people have had their lives altered by the restrictions used to combat COVID, some losing jobs and livelihoods, others missing out on special times with loved ones, and still more of us exhausted and confused by ever-changing rules. Some would have you believe that the public health response is without fault, while others would deny the very real challenges posed by Omicron, which will result in growing numbers of hospitalisations and illness. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. We must chart a path back to that middle ground that unites us, and not allow ourselves to be divided into warring factions, inextricably and increasingly opposed. The protest at Parliament includes people who are showing a flagrant disregard for the law, blocking off streets, ignoring rules, and abusing Wellingtonians. This hasn't been helped by a Prime Minister who is missing in action, and Trevor Mallard, who has done nothing but inflame the situation. However, there are frustrations shared by law-abiding and well-intentioned people up and down the country about the government's approach to COVID and its lack of a plan. This debate should not take place between lawmakers and lawbreakers on the forecourt of Parliament while roads are illegally occupied and death threats hang in the air. However, there are urgent issues before our elected representatives that must be confronted. It is simply not sufficient for the government to stand to one side while the protest rages, sheeting responsibility to the police and ignoring the wider debates that fuel it. Kiwis should be able to sympathise with some of the issues being raised by protesters on Parliament's grounds without being framed as condoning illegal behaviour or siding with anti-science conspiracy theorists. The government's unwillingness to engage with these issues has amplified division. The dismissal of anyone who questions the government approach has fed a growing distrust. New Zealanders have done the right thing. We've got vaccinated in record numbers. We're getting boosted, we get tested, we've downloaded the app, we scan in, we wear our masks. We've tolerated being shut off from the rest of the world for 2 years. But here we are in February 2022, and there seems no pathway out of ever more restrictions, rules and controls, which are driving so much hurt and anger. 14-year-old kids who can't play rugby outside with their mates because they're not vaccinated. Charlotte Bellis being treated better by the Taliban than by her own government. The daughter stuck in an MIQ hotel despite testing negative while her mum dies just a few blocks away. The restaurant trying to make money in the red setting with fewer than 100 people allowed in at any one time. The families grappling with ever-changing rules, the business owner trying to get rapid tests so they can keep their staff safe, the tourism business closing down because there is just no plan for when visitors will be back in New Zealand. The mum and dad who can't get a rapid test before visiting grandparents at the local rest home, overloaded hospital staff who simply don't see the promised extra ICU beds or the extra nurses or any extra investment. That's the anger, hurt and frustration that I hear and see every day. And many of you listening will recognise a description of yourselves there. And if you do, I want to send you a very clear message. I feel your pain and I understand it. And I want you to know there is a better way under National. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister has gone missing in action at precisely the moment the country is looking for leadership. People don't want more platitudes from the podium, they want leadership. They want to know when and under what circumstances vaccine mandates will end and when vaccine passes won't be required anymore. They want to know when tourists will be able to come to New Zealand once again. They want to know when gathering limits will be lifted and when events can run again. They don't need the exact dates, but they want to know the government's got their back and is being proactive, not letting COVID set the agenda by just waiting and seeing. There is a real momentum for change in the country and people are fed up. Now I want to outline to you what I think the government should be doing right now to heal the divisions I talked about earlier and to plot a pathway out of the mess we're in. COVID is very different in February 2022 to what it was in February 2020. Back then we had no vaccines, limited testing and no effective treatments. As scientists are recognising, COVID has transformed from a deadly disease to one that is much less serious. Omicron is highly infectious, but milder. COVID is now manageable for the vast bulk of people at home. It isn't the flu, but it is similar to other infectious diseases in that it can be controlled and managed. And when we have highly promising COVID treatments coming soon, that will help too. As Dr. Brian Betty of the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners says, we need to move into a space very rapidly of thinking we're going to live with this and get back to some sort of normality. There are some in our community who are still in 2020 mode. They're fearful and they want high levels of government control and zero balancing of public health with wider societal goals. And I understand this perspective and I acknowledge that the change from full protection to risk management will be a hard transition for some. Some may choose to be risk averse for some time into the future, whether or not the government requires that of them. Then there are those who just say, let it rip. And I understand their impatience, but I'm also alive to the serious consequences that this would bring. It's a recipe for overwhelming our health system. We would probably cope, but COVID would trump everything else. Elective surgery and other important procedures would grind to a halt. There is a third way through this, and that way is to use effective public health measures like vaccination, boosters, testing and treatments, but to start returning normality to people's lives, to start reducing the rules and restrictions, phasing out the mandates and easing the divisions that have sprung up in our community. That's where I'm at, and it's where National is at. Vaccination has been transformational, and despite our slow start, New Zealand is now one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. 95% of New Zealanders aged 12 and above have had 2 doses, 2/3 of those eligible have had a booster, and half of 5 to 11-year-olds have had 1 dose already. Vaccination and boosters are protecting our hospital system, and it makes a huge difference. Unvaccinated people are much more likely to end up in hospital than those vaccinated, and much more likely to die. The good news is that New Zealanders have done the right thing. We have got vaccinated, we have got boosted, we're vaccinating our kids, and now we're looking for what's next. There's no doubt about it, the next couple of months will be bumpy. We're on the upward slope of the Omicron curve. Cases will keep rising quickly. There will be families who lose loved ones and individuals who will endure serious illness. But at some point, cases will peak and then start to come down. That's been the experience in every other developed country that has grappled with Omicron. And so we need to keep going with getting boosted and getting our kids vaccinated, deploy rapid tests widely, accept that Omicron is here and get through it. We don't need to lock down, we just need to be sensible. And once we're through the peak, and assuming there's no other dangerous variants on the horizon, we can start to ease the division in our society and get back to something approaching normal life. Very soon, vaccine mandates will have to come to an end. And it's a big thing for a government to impose a mandate on someone, because by definition, you're pressuring people to do something they don't want to do by imposing pretty awful consequences if they don't. And the way I think about it, mandates were justified for a while as a temporary measure as we battled COVID and lifted vaccination rates. What we need from the government is an honest conversation and some straight talking over the issue of mandates. It's just not good enough for the Prime Minister to shrug her shoulders and say they'll go at some point and not enter into a dialogue over when and how. We deserve more than that. The mandates were designed for a world in which Delta was the dominant strain, but Omicron has changed the game. Under our current system, vaccinated people can go to a cafe, the unvaccinated can't. Vaccinated people can go to the gym, the unvaccinated can't. Vaccinated people can get a haircut, the unvaccinated can't. This made sense when vaccination had a big effect on transmission. But Omicron is just so infectious and busts through vaccination, including boosters. Vaccination is still definitely worth it for individuals. It makes us far less likely to get seriously ill. But when vaccinated people can get Omicron and spread it, why are we limiting venues to just vaccinated people? The public health rationale for mandates is much less than it was just a few short months ago. And it doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer to point this out. The mandates have caused real hardship and despair. Kids denied entry to sports teams or public libraries, good men and women who've lost their jobs because they don't want to be vaccinated. We should get rid of mandates progressively and carefully once we are through the peak of Omicron. We must balance the public health rationale against the massive impact mandates have on individual New Zealanders. The government should set out a plan for phasing out mandates, and maybe here's where they should start. The first area where vaccination was made compulsory was border workers. That made a lot of sense when we had an elimination strategy, and border worker vaccinations were the tool for keeping COVID out of the community. It obviously makes much less sense when we have thousands of community cases, and as the border reopens to the world, they need to go. The mandates I find most objectionable are the ones that apply to children taking part in extracurricular sport after school. They make no sense and they should be gone. I continue to think that mandates for healthcare workers are reasonable. You want people dealing with COVID in our hospitals to be vaccinated, for example. We also need a conversation about the traffic light framework and vaccine passes. Let's face it, it was developed on the fly after the alert level framework became redundant, and it is a complex set of rules that are not strictly adhered to. The system has been an absolute killer for hospitality. These businesses are doing the hard yards right now, and they need Kiwis to have confidence to go out and support them. Labor were advised to only apply vaccine passes to high-risk large events and venues. They were specifically told to apply them to bars, not to apply them to bars, restaurants and cafes. And they haven't even followed the official advice. The government was told that social cohesion was at risk if vaccine passes were implemented too widely, and I think we can definitely agree with that. After we get through the peak of Omicron, we should remove government mandates for businesses to use vaccine passes. The final thing we should do is aggressively reopen to the world. The government has outlined extremely tentative reopening plans. Kiwis in Australia can come home from the end of February. Kiwis elsewhere have to wait until March. Australians can't come until July, and other visa holders can't come until October. This is an absurdly slow time frame, and to make matters worse, everyone coming in will have to isolate for 7 days. This will kill any real tourism recovery. The case for mandatory self-isolation for travellers to New Zealand is not a strong one. We should quickly move to a rule where people take a test on arrival in New Zealand. If it's positive, then they should isolate. If it's negative, they should be free to go about their business, just like Kiwis do within New Zealand. We should also speed up the time frame. The border should be open right now for Kiwis anywhere in the world to return home. Then we should quickly open to tourists and other visa holders too. One of the worst things about the past couple of years has been the way the government shut out Kiwi citizens through the lottery of human misery that is MIQ, stirring up resentment from Kiwis both at home and overseas. That divide will take some time to heal, but we can start by progressively reopening to the world and welcoming Kiwis home. The protest is illustrative of frustration at COVID, but we also have other challenges: a cost of living crisis, increasing benefit dependency, house prices through the roof, and the sense that it is harder than ever to get ahead in New Zealand. The country needs new leadership that knows how to get things done and get our COVID toolset in place. Leadership that isn't too proud to call it when we get things wrong and admit mistakes. Leadership that shows us when times are tough, not just in the glory moments. New Zealand is a fantastic country and we have a great future ahead of us. We will get what we deserve, and we deserve, frankly, the very best. But ultimately, that is up to each and every one of us. And if we join together, and if we celebrate our differences rather than letting them divide us, we really can deliver a better future for all New Zealanders. Thank you.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And, I just want to thank God for giving me the strength to step out of my comfort zone, and thank you for the opportunity to
keep on opening. Our use of MIQ, which has helped us so much, will change dramatically. And as we reach that peak and start to come down, we can start to move towards a life that feels a little more like a new normal that we can all live with. 2022 is about moving forward. New Zealand is in demand internationally, and again, our primary goal is to manage COVID with as few restrictions and accelerate our economic recovery, while continuing to ensure that lives and livelihoods are protected. And while everything I have said today has been directed to every New Zealander who is anxious about the future, either because they're afraid or because they just want COVID to be over, I'll leave this final message for those occupying the lawns of Parliament. Everyone is over COVID. No one wants to live with rules or restrictions. But had we not all been willing to work together to protect one another, then we all would have been worse off as individuals, including losing people we love. That hasn't happened here for the most part, and that is a fact worth celebrating rather than protesting. We all want to go back to the way that life was, and we will, I suspect, sooner than you think. But when that happens, It will be because easing restrictions won't compromise the lives of thousands of people, not because you demanded it. Now is not the time to dismantle our hard work and preparation, to remove our armour just as the battle begins. I'll now hand over to Minister Robertson, who will set out new economic supports for businesses who have been affected by Omicron.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Ngāmihi nui kia koutou katoa. When the government made the hard decisions in 2020 and 2021 to put New Zealand into lockdown, it was clear that we needed to put in place broad-based financial support to help our workers and businesses get through. Since the beginning of the pandemic almost 2 years ago, the government has paid out almost $23 billion in support via the wage subsidy scheme, the resurgent support payment, and the small business cash flow loan scheme. Taking into account other related support, more than $25 billion worth of income and financial support has been paid out since the onset of COVID-19. This has contributed to the New Zealand economy performing better than many of the countries we compare ourselves to and ahead of our forecasts. Throughout the pandemic, we've been monitoring our support schemes and adapting them to fit with the changing impacts of the pandemic and the needs of businesses and workers. As I said back in October when we announced the traffic light system, the government has been monitoring the impact of the new framework on businesses and the economy. Overall activity in the economy has remained strong as most businesses are able to operate with only limited restrictions. This reinforces the decision not to have across-the-board financial support like the wage subsidy scheme available during the COVID protection framework. However, for some sectors there has been a significant decline. The latest retail card data that we have shows that spending on food and beverage services, art and recreation services and accommodation all fell further compared with the same week in 2020, down 27%, 47% and 59% respectively. When we created the COVID protection framework, we were clear that it was still possible for people to travel, eat out and go to bars, albeit with restrictions. It was not possible to predict how people would behave under the settings or as Omicron took hold. A combination of the gathering restrictions, particularly in hospitality, and people's behavioural responses has seen an impact that may cause some viable businesses to cease to be able to operate. Therefore, we have to act. We've looked closely at how best to target this support. We have created some bespoke packages for the arts and events sectors. However, doing the same for hospitality or accommodation runs into significant definitional and integrity issues. In order to provide targeted support, we have decided to use a revenue drop figure that is higher than we previously had in place, and there will be declarations required to link the revenue drop to the impact of the COVID protection framework and the spread of Omicron. A new payment has been created, the COVID support payment, which is similar to the former resurgent support payment. The COVID support payment will be $4,000 per business plus $400 per full-time employee, capped at 50 FTEs or $24,000. This is the same calculation as we used for the transition support payment just before Christmas. Applications for the first payment will open on the 28th of February, with payments starting from the 1st of March. It will be available on a fortnightly basis for 6 weeks, so 3 payments in total. We believe that this will get people through the worst of the Omicron outbreak, but as I've said, we constantly monitor the situation and we do have the option to extend this if necessary. Like the resurgent support payment, there are criteria. Firms must show a 40% drop in 7 consecutive days within the 6 weeks prior to the shift to phase 2 of the Omicron response on the 15th of February. As before, there will be exceptions for seasonal businesses. The revenue drop test is the most effective way to target support to where it is needed most. It captures the businesses within specific sectors that are the most affected and by proxy targets particular sectors over those less affected. The Treasury estimates that the cost of each payment will be between $160 and $260 million. I'm also announcing today that we are making changes to the small business cash flow loan scheme to increase the amount of funding available to eligible businesses through a new top-up loan. The top-up loan will allow those firms that have already accessed the loan to draw down an additional $10,000 with a new repayment period of 5 years and the first 2 years being interest-free as they are now. Cabinet has also agreed to remove the first 2 years of accrued base interest from all borrowers who have or will take out a loan under the scheme. This change will mean that interest will only start accruing at the beginning of year 3. These changes will come into effect in about 4 weeks. Finally, we are also extending Inland Revenue's flexibility for tax payments to assist firms with cash flow pressures. This means that if a business is struggling to pay its tax in full or on time because of COVID-19, it can pay it off over time simply by setting up an instalment arrangement in their MyIR account. Inland Revenue also has existing discretions for providing financial relief for customers that have been unable to pay their tax on time. I strongly encourage businesses struggling to pay tax because of the impacts of COVID to communicate with Inland Revenue to see if they could delay starting payments to a later date or if any part of their tax could be written off. Inland Revenue can help with GST and provisional tax payments. We have sufficient resources in the COVID response and recovery fund to cover the costs of these announcements. However, we have taken the precaution of topping the fund up by $5 billion to cover for other expenditure that is expected, in particular to support the health response to Omicron, including the purchase of vaccines, antiviral drugs, and the ongoing support for increasing the capacity of the health system. As we previously said, the money will only be spent when it is needed. We have the resources to do this because the economy continues to outperform expectations and our levels of debt remain below forecast and relatively low compared to the rest of the world. I want to finish by reiterating something that the Prime Minister has said. We know from the international experience that Omicron cases rise rapidly but then hit a peak after around 4 to 6 weeks, and then they drop off. We also know that consumer demand tends to pick up very quickly. Under our settings of the COVID protection framework, people can continue to go out, shop and travel. And our Reconnecting New Zealand framework will see the borders progressively more open. So my message to the business community is that we are providing temporary support to get through this phase. But there is every reason to be confident that this will pass relatively quickly and businesses will be able to operate normally as they have done for extended periods over the last 2 years. Prime Minister.
All right.
Prime Minister, for 2 weeks, people haven't been able to move around our capital city. Why not give a date for when mandates will end?
You've given a very clear indication here today that firstly, we'll be looking to do that when it is safe to do so. But all of the evidence is suggesting, and our experts, that once we come down off the other side of a peak, and we know our hospitals have coped, and frankly, unfortunately, more of those unvaccinated individuals will have been exposed to COVID. That means we're less likely to need vaccine passes and mandates, and that is when it will be safe to start removing them.
Do you have confidence in the Police Commissioner?
Yes, I do, and I've expressed confidence, of course, in the enormous job and very difficult job that the police do on our behalf every day, including on the forecourt of Parliament right now. That doesn't mean necessarily that every single decision that's made there will be broad agreement with, but that does not change my absolute support for the police force.
You've got a situation where people can't move around the capital city. Who is responsible for that and for doing something?
Well, when it comes to the enforcement of the law, there is absolute clarity that that is a decision for the police, and that is for very good reason. You've got to have the independence of the police, or people will of course lose faith if you ever have politicians interfering with decisions around charging and arresting citizens. That has to lay with them. Gina.
Sorry, do you believe police could have acted sooner then?
Yeah, ultimately the thing that will resolve what is occurring out on our forecourt right now and in the centre of Wellington and obstructing business, passers-by, school children, will be protesters leaving. So let's be really clear on where the responsibility now sits for resolving this situation. There will be a time when we'll have the opportunity to cast back and learn from this situation, but right now my message would be a simple one. The protesters have made their point. It is time for them to leave.
You've said that this is not, your speech today wasn't a response to the demands
Absolutely
of
not.
protesters, but with the opposition parties taking a more sympathetic view to what the protesters are advocating for, have you felt pressure to respond to those protesters' demands?
What I feel is a responsibility to keep New Zealanders safe through this pandemic, but to continue to ease all of the restrictions as it is safe to do so. And we're getting a very clear indication based on what we're seeing internationally on when we believe that will be able to occur. But I can tell you, it's not as you're on the upside of a growing outbreak. It's when you come down that it'll be safe to do that. And look, to the opposition, I would say, we all took as parties a position, rightly so, that none of us would engage with what is ultimately illegal activity outside that borders on and demonstrates bullying and harassment of Wellingtonian. I find their position at the moment quite upsetting to see now they seem to be responding and sympathising with the protesters.
They've had human waste thrown at them this morning. How disgusting is that behaviour?
You know, I grew up in a police family, and so that is why I feel like I have a real appreciation of the difficult job that police officers do on our behalf day in, day out. No one should have to face having human waste thrown at them while they're just trying to keep people safe.
Prime Minister,
Yeah.
you mentioned a period of 6 weeks early on. Is that
Yeah.
the period that you would be able to tell the protesters, if you had talked to them, that they could be looking at the removal of mandates?
So what I've set out today is based on modelling an overseas experience as a view that in 3 to 6 weeks we'll likely see that peak. And what we'll then be looking for is a clear indication that we are on the other side of it, that hospitalisation rates have normalised and our health system has demonstrated that it's been able to hold up against that higher caseload. That's when we'll be in a position to then safely start easing both things like gathering limits, but also moving away from things like vaccine passes. We've also been clear that the reason our experts believe that will be safe to do at that point is because so many more people, including, sadly, unvaccinated individuals, will have